The moment I saw Malik Washington on my class roster, I felt my shoulders tense. Another scholarship kid who probably wouldn't last the semester. I couldn't have been more wrong about what that name would teach me about myself. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and for 15 years, I've been a literature professor at Millfield University in Connecticut. I thought I knew who I was, a dedicated educator, fair and impartial, someone who judged students solely on their academic merit. I lived in my comfortable suburban home with its white picket fence and meticulously maintained garden, drove my reliable Honda Civic to campus each morning at exactly 7:45 a.m., and took pride in my reputation as a tough but fair professor who demanded excellence from every student. My office walls were lined with degrees, BA from Yale, PhD from Harvard, and photos of me with notable literary figures from conferences and book signings. Behind my mahogany desk sat shelves filled with first edition novels, poetry collections, and critical theory texts that I'd accumulated over decades of academic life. I believed I had worked hard for everything I had, climbing from a middle-class family in suburban Ohio to the ivory towers of higher education through sheer determination and intellectual rigor. I expected the same dedication and natural ability from my students. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was about the assumptions I carried. Assumptions that would shatter completely on a crisp October morning when a young man walked into my classroom and forced me to confront the prejudices I didn't even know I harbored. I taught advanced American literature, a rigorous course that typically attracted serious English majors and pre-law students planning to attend graduate school. The class size was deliberately small, usually around 20 students, which allowed for intimate discussions about complex themes in works by authors like Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, and Zora Neale Hurston. Ironically, I spent my days teaching about prejudice and racism in literature while harboring unconscious biases of my own. The course was known across campus as one of the most challenging in the English department. I required extensive reading, often a novel per week, plus supplementary critical essays, and demanded that students engage with difficult questions about race, class, identity, and power in American society. My exams were notoriously difficult, my papers meticulously graded, and my classroom discussions intense enough that unprepared students quickly found themselves overwhelmed. I had a waiting list every semester, mostly filled with high-achieving students who saw my class as a necessary challenge for their academic careers. These were typically the children of lawyers, doctors, and business executives, students who had attended prestigious prep schools and arrived at university with strong foundations in literary analysis and critical thinking. They knew how to navigate academic expectations, how to speak the language of higher education, how to present themselves as serious scholars. That semester started like any other. I reviewed my roster during the week before classes began, mentally preparing for the mix of students I'd encounter. I had learned over the years to form preliminary impressions based on names, using them to anticipate the kinds of contributions students might make to class discussions. Most names were familiar territory: Ashley Morrison, Connor Bradford, Madison Wellington, Trevor St. James, names that fit the profile of our typical student body, names that suggested prep school educations and families with deep pockets and deeper expectations. But when I saw Malik Washington, something in me reacted in a way that still makes me ashamed to remember. I told myself it was just curiosity, just the natural process of wondering about a new student. But if I'm being brutally honest, it was something much darker and more troubling. I found myself wondering if he was here on a diversity scholarship, if he'd struggle with the reading load, if he'd be able to keep up with the sophisticated analysis required for success in my classroom. Would he participate in discussions about racial themes in literature, or would he remain silent, perhaps feeling self-conscious about being one of the few students of color in the room? These thoughts embarrassed me even then, but I pushed them aside, telling myself I was just being practical, preparing for different learning styles and backgrounds. What a profound lie that was. I spent that week before classes reviewing my syllabus, adjusting reading assignments, and preparing my opening lecture about the power of literature to challenge societal assumptions. The irony of that theme, given my own unconscious biases, would become painfully clear soon enough. The first day of class arrived with that familiar September energy that always reminded me why I loved teaching. The air was crisp with autumn promise, leaves just beginning to turn, and students moved across campus with the renewed purpose that comes with a fresh semester. I arrived at my classroom 15 minutes early, as was my habit, arranging my materials and writing the day's discussion questions on the whiteboard in my careful, practiced handwriting. Students filed into my classroom at precisely 9 a.m., claiming their seats with the territorial precision of young adults, establishing their academic identities. I stood at the front, coffee mug in hand, watching them settle in with the keen observation that had become second nature over 15 years of teaching. Most were the typical Millfield students, well-dressed in that effortless way that spoke of comfortable family finances, confident in their bearing, already forming social clusters based on shared backgrounds and mutual recognition. Ashley Morrison took her usual seat in the front row, her designer notebook and precisely organized pens spread before her like tools of academic warfare. Connor Bradford settled into his preferred spot near the window, where he could occasionally gaze out at the quad while maintaining the appearance of deep concentration. Madison Wellington whispered quietly with Trevor St. James about their summers abroad, their voices carrying the casual entitlement of young people accustomed to international travel and cultural enrichment. Then he walked in. Malik Washington entered my classroom at exactly 9:03 a.m., and I felt my carefully constructed professorial composure falter. He was not what I had expected, and that realization hit me like a physical blow to my academic conscience. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with warm brown skin that seemed to glow with health and vitality. His smile was easy and genuine as he glanced around the room, taking in his classmates and surroundings with intelligent, curious eyes. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt that looked expensive, dark jeans that fit perfectly, and carried a worn leather messenger bag that had the patina of quality and long use. His hair was neatly cut in a style that was both professional and contemporary, his posture confident but not arrogant. Everything about his appearance spoke of care, attention to detail, and self-respect. He looked around the room with the assurance of someone completely comfortable in academic settings before choosing a seat in the third row, directly in my line of sight. I felt my face flush with shame as I recognized the ugly assumptions I had been harboring. What exactly had I been expecting? The question haunted me as I began my opening lecture about the power of literature to challenge our preconceptions and force us to examine our deepest beliefs about society and human nature. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment of profound discomfort. Literature, I heard myself saying, my voice perhaps a bit too loud in the quiet classroom, has the unique ability to make us question our assumptions about the world and about each other. Great writers don't simply tell us what to think. They force us to examine why we think what we think, to confront the comfortable prejudices that allow us to navigate the world without truly seeing it. Malik was taking notes, his pen moving steadily across the page in handwriting that looked both thoughtful and precise. He looked up occasionally, making eye contact when I made particularly important points, nodding slightly when something resonated with him. His engagement was evident, his focus complete. Authors like Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, I continued, warming to my theme while simultaneously struggling with my own hypocrisy, force us to confront uncomfortable truths about American society. They hold up mirrors that reflect not just individual prejudices, but systemic inequalities that we might prefer to ignore. As I spoke, I found myself watching Malik's reactions, looking for signs of what? Discomfort? Agreement? Superior knowledge about the racial dynamics I was discussing? The very fact that I was monitoring his responses differently than those of other students should have been a red flag. But I was too caught up in my own unconscious biases to recognize the problem. The class proceeded smoothly, with students introducing themselves and sharing their academic interests. When it came to Malik's turn, he spoke with quiet confidence about his passion for American literature, particularly works that explored themes of identity and belonging. His vocabulary was sophisticated, his thoughts well organized, his presence commanding without being domineering. Several other students nodded approvingly at his comments, clearly recognizing a serious scholar among their ranks. As the weeks progressed, my discomfort only grew, but not for the reasons I had initially anticipated. Malik was an exceptional student, perhaps the most naturally gifted I had encountered in years. His essays were insightful, demonstrating a depth of analysis that went far beyond surface-level interpretation. His writing style was elegant and precise, showing influences from classical rhetoric as well as contemporary critical theory. His participation in class discussions was thoughtful and well-informed, revealing a breadth of reading that impressed even me. He clearly came from a family that valued education deeply. His references to books, his sophisticated vocabulary, his critical thinking skills, and his comfort with complex theoretical concepts all pointed to a rich intellectual background. During discussions, he would casually mention authors I had never heard of, philosophical concepts that went beyond our curriculum, and historical context that demonstrated extensive independent reading. But instead of celebrating his success and recognizing his obvious talent, I found myself looking for reasons to diminish it. When he submitted a brilliant 10-page analysis of Invisible Man that demonstrated a nuanced understanding of Ellison's use of symbolism and metaphor, I wondered if he had received help from a tutor, or if perhaps he had access to critical essays that other students might not have found. When he made an insightful comment during our discussion of Beloved about the relationship between memory and identity in Morrison's work, I questioned whether he truly understood the complexity of the novel or was simply repeating something he had read online. These thoughts filled me with shame even as I had them, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from engaging in this mental process of undermining and questioning. It was as if some unconscious part of my mind refused to accept that this young black man could be genuinely brilliant without some external explanation or assistance. The breaking point came during our unit on James Baldwin, an author whose work I had been teaching for over a decade. We were discussing Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin's profound meditation on race, family, and identity in America. I had assigned a personal reflection essay about confronting difficult truths about family and society, asking students to examine moments in their own lives when they had been forced to confront uncomfortable realities about themselves or their communities. It was always a challenging assignment, one that required vulnerability, deep thinking, and the courage to examine one's own assumptions and prejudices. Over the years, I had read hundreds of these essays, most of them earnest attempts by privileged young people to grapple with concepts of inequality and injustice that existed largely outside their personal experience. When I collected the essays on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, I noticed that Malik's was visibly shorter than the others, only 3 pages compared to the required 5. My heart sank with a mixture of disappointment and, I'm ashamed to admit, a terrible satisfaction. Finally, here was proof that my initial instincts had been right. Here was the evidence I had been unconsciously waiting for. Proof that he wasn't quite as capable as he appeared, that his previous successes had been flukes or the result of external assistance. I saved his essay for last when grading that evening, already composing the feedback in my head about meeting requirements and putting in full effort. I poured myself a glass of wine, settled into my home office with its familiar comforts, soft lighting, classical music, the quiet satisfaction of evaluating student work, and opened his paper with a mixture of disappointment and vindication. The title stopped me cold, When Your Name Becomes Your Prison. I've carried my father's name like a weight since kindergarten, Malik's essay began, and I could immediately tell that this was unlike anything I had read before. The prose was not just competent, it was masterful, with a rhythm and power that reminded me of Baldwin himself. Malik Washington, a name that teachers would pause over during roll call, their voices faltering slightly as they tried to navigate what they perceived as foreign territory. A name that made basketball coaches approach me in hallways with assumptions about my athletic abilities, despite my obvious preference for books over sports. A name that made store clerks follow me through aisles with suspicious eyes, as if the combination of my appearance and my identity automatically marked me as a potential threat to their merchandise and their comfort. My coffee grew cold as I read, my earlier satisfaction evaporating into something much more uncomfortable. His writing was raw and honest, beautifully crafted with a literary sophistication that surpassed most graduate-level work I had encountered. Every sentence was precisely constructed, every paragraph building toward a larger argument about identity, expectation, and the exhausting burden of constantly having to prove one's worthiness. I never realized how much a name could shape other people's expectations until I started watching how they looked at me differently than my friends. He continued. When James Chen spoke up in class, teachers nodded approvingly and built upon his comments. When I offered the same insights, I could see the surprise in their eyes, as if intelligence coming from someone who looked like me was somehow unexpected, somehow noteworthy in ways that the same intelligence in others was not. The essay went on to detail his experiences as the only black student in advanced classes throughout high school. He wrote about teachers who were genuinely surprised by his academic performance, who would compliment his work with language that revealed their unconscious biases. "You're so articulate," they would say. Or "you write so well for someone from your background," never seeming to realize that these compliments were actually insults wrapped in good intentions. He described guidance counselors who, despite his perfect GPA and exceptional standardized test scores, had steered him toward community college and practical majors, suggesting that perhaps he should consider trades or vocational programs rather than setting his sights on competitive universities. When he insisted on applying to top-tier schools, one counselor had actually said, "Well, I suppose you can always try, but you should have realistic backup plans." The hardest part, he continued in prose that made my chest ache with recognition and shame, wasn't the obvious racism, the slurs whispered in hallways, the jokes told just loudly enough for me to hear, the assumptions about my family's economic status or educational background. It was the subtle stuff that wore me down day after day. The raised eyebrows when I knew the answer to difficult questions. The surprise when I scored highest on tests. The way people would compliment my articulate speech as if speaking standard English was some kind of miracle for someone with my appearance. It made me question everything about myself. Was I actually intelligent? Or was everyone just grading me on a curve? Were my achievements real? Or were they the result of lowered expectations and diversity initiatives? I set the paper down, my hands actually shaking. This young man had been living with the weight of other people's prejudices his entire life, constantly having to prove not just his competence but his right to occupy academic spaces. And here I was, adding to that burden with my own unconscious biases, questioning his achievements and looking for evidence that would confirm my preconceptions, rather than celebrating his obvious brilliance. The essay went on to describe his family in detail that shattered every assumption I had made. His father, Dr. Marcus Washington, was a cardiologist who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School and completed his residency at Johns Hopkins. His mother, Dr. Angela Washington, was a high school principal with a doctorate in educational leadership who had spent 15 years transforming underperforming schools in urban districts. His younger sister, Zara, was a high school sophomore who was already being recruited by Ivy League schools for her combination of academic excellence and leadership in student government. They lived in an affluent suburb outside Boston, in a colonial-style house that his father had purchased after years of saving and working double shifts to pay off medical school loans. The house featured a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with literature, philosophy, history, and scientific texts. Family dinners often turned into intellectual discussions about current events, literary analysis, and philosophical questions that would challenge graduate students. People see my name and my face and they think they know my story, Malik wrote with a precision that cut straight to my conscience. They assume struggle, assume disadvantage, assume I'm here to fill some quota or satisfy some diversity requirement. They don't see the dinner table conversations about Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois that shaped my intellectual development. They don't see the family library with first edition books my grandmother collected during her career as a literature professor at Howard University. They don't see parents who saved for years and sacrificed luxuries to give their children every possible advantage. They just see what they expect to see, what confirms their comfortable assumptions about race and achievement in America. The essay revealed that his grandmother, Dr. Dorothy Washington, had been one of the first black women to earn a Ph.D. in English literature, writing her dissertation on the Harlem Renaissance at a time when such opportunities were rare and precious. She had instilled in her family a deep love of literature and learning, creating a legacy of academic excellence that stretched back generations. Malik had grown up surrounded by books, ideas, and the expectation that education was not just important, but sacred. His parents had deliberately chosen to live in a predominantly white suburb because of the quality of the schools, knowing that their children would face challenges, but believing that excellent education was worth the social difficulties. They had prepared Malik and his sister for the microaggressions they would encounter, teaching them to maintain their dignity while navigating spaces where they might be the only black faces in the room. Every achievement I've earned, Malik wrote, has been scrutinized in ways that my white classmates' achievements never are. When I win academic awards, people wonder if I really deserved them or if they were given to me because of my race. When I score higher than others on standardized tests, they question whether I had some kind of unfair advantage. When I write papers that earn praise from teachers, they speculate about whether I had help or whether the grading was somehow adjusted to account for my background. The final paragraph of his essay gutted me completely. I've learned that carrying my name means carrying the weight of other people's assumptions every single day. Some days I want to introduce myself as M.J. Washington, or use my middle name, Christopher, just to see what it feels like to be judged on my ideas rather than my identity. But my father told me something I'll never forget. Son, you don't change your name to make other people comfortable. You make them comfortable with your name by showing them who you really are, over and over again, until they have no choice but to see your brilliance. So I carry the name Malik Washington with pride, even when it feels heavy, even when it makes others uncomfortable, because it represents not just me but generations of excellence that came before me. I sat in my home office until nearly midnight, staring at that essay and feeling the full weight of my own prejudices crashing down around me. Every assumption I had made about this student, every moment of doubt I had harbored about his capabilities, every time I had questioned whether his success was real, it all came flooding back with crushing clarity. The worst part was realizing that my behavior, my skepticism, my subtle dismissals, my unconscious bias playing out in real time, was exactly what he had been writing about. I was part of the problem he had been facing his entire academic career. I was one of those teachers who claimed to value equality while unconsciously perpetuating the very system of assumptions and prejudices that made students like Malik have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. I thought about all the ways I had undermined him, all the moments when I had looked for reasons to doubt rather than reasons to celebrate. When he had turned in that brilliant analysis of Invisible Man, I should have been thrilled to have such an insightful student in my classroom. Instead, I had questioned whether the work was really his own. When he had made those profound connections during our discussions of Morrison's work, I should have built upon his insights and encouraged him to pursue graduate studies. Instead, I had wondered if he was just repeating things he had read elsewhere. The next morning, I arrived at campus early, my stomach churning with anxiety and shame. I had to face Malik in class, had to look him in the eye knowing what I now knew about my own prejudices. More importantly, I had to figure out how to address this. With him, with myself, with my other students who might be witnessing and learning from my unconscious biases. Class began as usual, but I felt different, raw, and exposed in ways that made it difficult to concentrate on my planned lesson. We were discussing Baldwin's essay about his relationship with his father, the complicated legacy of pain and love that gets passed down through generations. The timing felt almost cosmically ironic. Here I was, trying to lead a discussion about seeing beyond prejudice and stereotype while grappling with the revelation of my own unconscious biases. Baldwin writes about the difficulty of seeing his father clearly, I said to the class, my voice perhaps more tentative than usual. He talks about how easy it is to reduce someone to our assumptions about them, to let our preconceptions prevent us from seeing their full humanity. As I spoke, I found myself looking directly at Malik, and our eyes met across the room. In that moment, I saw something there that made my breath catch. Not accusation, but awareness. A deep, knowing look that told me he understood exactly what I was going through. He knew. Somehow he had sensed my struggle with his presence in the classroom, my unconscious bias playing out in real time, and he was watching me work through my realization with what looked like patience, mixed with resignation. Baldwin had to learn to see his father not as the stereotype of an angry black man, I continued, feeling the words stick in my throat, but as a complex individual shaped by circumstances, experiences, and choices that went far beyond any simple categorization. Madison Wellington raised her hand. But isn't it natural to make assumptions based on our experiences? I mean, how else do we navigate the world? It was Connor Bradford who answered, surprising me with the thoughtfulness of his response. I think the problem isn't that we make assumptions, but that we don't question them. Like I realized recently that I assume things about people based on really superficial stuff, and I never really examined where those assumptions came from. Ashley Morrison nodded. It's like when people assume I'm not serious about my studies because I care about fashion. People see my designer clothes and think I'm just here to find a husband or something. It's frustrating when people don't look beyond surface stuff. I watched Malik's face during this exchange, seeing him weigh whether to contribute to a conversation that was clearly touching on themes central to his own experience. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. I think the hardest part, he said, is when people think they're being progressive by noticing that you've exceeded their expectations. Like when someone's surprised that you're intelligent or articulate, and they think they're giving you a compliment. But really they're revealing that they had low expectations to begin with. The classroom fell silent. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and I could see them processing his words, perhaps recognizing moments when they had done exactly what he was describing. Trevor Street James looked genuinely troubled. I never thought about it that way, but I think I've probably said stuff like that before, like, "Oh wow, you're really smart," as if that was somehow surprising based on, I don't know what. It's not that people are trying to be mean, Malik continued with remarkable grace. Most of the time, they think they're being nice. But it's exhausting to constantly have to prove that you deserve to be in spaces that other people just get to occupy without question. After class, I found myself walking toward him as he packed up his books. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to say something. The conversation had created an opening, a moment of honesty that I couldn't let pass. "Malik," I called out, my voice smaller than usual. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" He turned, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Of course, Professor Mitchell." "I wanted to talk to you about your essay," I began, then stopped. The other students were filing out, chatting among themselves about the day's discussion, but I couldn't have this conversation in the hallway. "Actually, could you come to my office?" "Sure," he said simply, and I could see in his eyes that he knew this conversation was going to be about more than just academic feedback. 20 minutes later, we sat across from each other in my small office, surrounded by all those degrees and accolades that suddenly felt meaningless. The walls that had once represented my academic achievements now seemed to mock me with their privilege and presumption. I had his essay in front of me, marked with an A+ and covered in comments I had written in the early hours of the morning, trying to find words adequate to respond to his powerful writing. "Your essay was extraordinary," I started, then took a breath that felt like the most important of my academic career. "But I need to apologize to you." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained quiet, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from figures of authority. "I realized while reading your work that I had assumptions about you from the moment I saw your name on my roster." The words felt thick and difficult, but I forced myself to continue. "I've been questioning your capabilities, your work, your place in this classroom in ways that were unfair and prejudiced. I'm deeply ashamed of that, and I'm so sorry." The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. I watched his face, seeing him process my admission, watching him decide how to respond to something that few professors would ever have the courage to acknowledge. I wondered if he would accept my apology, or if the damage was already done, if months of unconscious bias had already created a rift that couldn't be repaired. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "I appreciate your honesty, Professor Mitchell. I could sense it, you know. The skepticism. I've gotten pretty good at reading those signals over the years. It's like a sixth sense you develop when you're constantly being judged." My stomach dropped. "I'm so sorry, Malik. There's no excuse for that behavior." "No, there isn't," he agreed. But his tone wasn't harsh. It was matter of fact. The voice of someone who had long ago accepted certain realities about the world. "But you know what? The fact that you recognized it, that you're sitting here apologizing for it, that's more than most people ever do. Usually, they just double down on their assumptions or get defensive when confronted with their biases." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, and I could see the intelligence and maturity that I had been too blinded by prejudice to fully appreciate. "Can I ask you something, Professor Mitchell?" I nodded, bracing myself for whatever insight or challenge he might offer. "What made you realize it? What changed for you?" I gestured to his essay, which lay between us like a bridge across months of misunderstanding. "Your writing, your story. Reading about your experience made me confront what I'd been doing to you. I realized I was part of the problem you'd been describing your whole life. I was one of those teachers who thinks they're progressive, but still carries around unconscious biases that affect how they treat students. And now that you know," he said, his eyes meeting mine directly, "what are you going to do about it?" It was a challenge, but a gentle one. I could see in his expression that this was a test of sorts. Would I retreat back into my comfortable assumptions and treat this conversation as a momentary lapse in judgment? Or would I actually commit to the difficult work of examining and changing my unconscious biases? "I want to do better," I said, and the words felt both inadequate and essential. "I want to learn. I want to understand how my behavior has affected not just you, but probably other students over the years. Would you be willing to help me understand? To call me out if I slip back into old patterns?" For the first time since entering my office, Malik smiled. It was a real smile, warm and genuine, that transformed his entire face. "Professor Mitchell, I think that's the most honest thing a teacher has ever said to me." "I mean it," I said, feeling tears prick my eyes. "I don't want to be someone who claims to fight prejudice in literature while perpetuating it in real life. I want to be better than that." "Okay," he said simply. "But you have to understand, this isn't going to be a one-time conversation. Recognizing bias is just the first step. The real work is changing patterns of thinking that have been reinforced for years, maybe decades." I nodded eagerly. "I'm willing to do that work. I need to do that work. And you have to be prepared for it to be uncomfortable," he continued. "You're going to catch yourself making assumptions about other students. You're going to realize that some of your teaching methods might inadvertently favor certain types of students over others. You're going to have to examine not just what you think, but how you think." "I understand," I said, though I was beginning to realize that I probably didn't fully understand yet. "Will you help me?" "I'll help you," he said, and I felt something shift in the space between us. "But on one condition." "Anything. You can't make this about easing your guilt. This has to be about actually becoming a better teacher for all your students. Not just about feeling better about yourself." The directness of his statement took my breath away. Here was a 20-year-old student showing more wisdom and clarity about racial dynamics than I had managed in 15 years of university teaching. "You're right," I said. "This isn't about me. It's about doing better." "Good," he said, standing up and shouldering his messenger bag. "Then let's get to work." That conversation became the beginning of one of the most important educational experiences of my academic career, though I was no longer the teacher. Malik didn't just accept my apology. He became my mentor in understanding the complex dynamics of unconscious bias, the exhaustion of constantly proving yourself worthy of the space you occupy, and the enormous strength it takes to carry dignity in the face of others' prejudice. Over the remaining months of the semester, he helped me understand his family's story in ways that shattered every assumption I had carried. His grandfather, Dr. William Washington, had been denied admission to medical school in the 1950s, despite graduating summa cum laude from Morehouse College, not because of his academic credentials, but because of his race. He had eventually earned his medical degree from Howard University and become a pioneering cardiologist in the South, performing surgeries that saved lives while facing threats and discrimination that would have broken lesser men. Malik's father had inherited that legacy of excellence under pressure, working twice as hard as his white classmates at Harvard Medical School to prove he belonged in operating rooms where patients sometimes requested different doctors when they saw his face. Dr. Marcus Washington had completed his residency while dealing with colleagues who questioned his competence and supervisors who scrutinized his every decision more carefully than they did those of other residents. But I also learned about the incredible richness of his family's intellectual tradition, the way they had built their own networks of support and excellence in spite of systemic barriers. The Washington family had created a kind of parallel universe of academic achievement, where excellence was expected, intellectual curiosity was nurtured, and education was treated as both a privilege and a responsibility. Malik's backpack, I discovered during our many conversations, was always filled with books that went far beyond assigned readings. He carried poetry collections by authors I had never heard of, philosophy texts that challenged conventional thinking, novels by writers from Africa, South America, and Asia that offered perspectives completely outside the traditional American literary canon. He read voraciously, not because he had to prove anything to anyone, but because his family had instilled in him a genuine love of learning that extended far beyond the classroom. His mother, Dr. Angela Washington, had shared stories with him about transforming failing schools by refusing to accept low expectations for students who looked like her own children. She had fought against tracking systems that channeled Black students away from advanced courses, had advocated for rigorous curricula that challenged every student regardless of their background, and had created mentorship programs that connected young people with professional role models. The transformation in our classroom dynamic was remarkable and immediate. As I became more aware of my own biases, I started noticing them in other contexts too. I caught myself making assumptions about other students, questioning Maria Gonzalez's analytical abilities because of her slight accent, wondering if Jin Chen's exceptional math skills meant he couldn't be equally strong in literature, assuming that Katie O'Brien's family wealth had somehow made her academic achievements less meaningful. Malik's presence in class discussions became more prominent as I stopped unconsciously undermining his contributions. When he spoke, I began to truly listen rather than looking for ways to diminish or question his insights. Other students began to notice his brilliance too, and classroom conversations became richer and more nuanced. He had always been exceptional. I had just been too blinded by my prejudices to fully appreciate and cultivate his talents. During our unit on contemporary literature, something beautiful happened that crystallized the change in our classroom dynamic. We were discussing a novel about immigration and identity, and the class was struggling with some of the complex themes about belonging and cultural authenticity. Several students had made surface-level observations, but no one seemed able to grasp the deeper philosophical questions the author was exploring. Malik raised his hand and made a connection between the immigrant protagonist's experience and Baldwin's writings about identity and exile that was so insightful, so perfectly articulated, that the entire room fell silent. He talked about how both authors explored the idea of being simultaneously inside and outside American culture, how they wrote about the exhaustion of constantly translating yourself for others while trying to maintain your authentic self. It's like Baldwin said, Malik concluded. You have to decide whether you're going to be crushed by other people's ignorance or whether you're going to use your experiences to build something stronger. Both authors show characters making that choice. When he finished speaking, the room remained quiet for a moment before Ashley Morrison, one of the students who rarely spoke in class, broke the silence. That's brilliant, Malik. I never would have seen that connection, but now it seems so obvious. You should definitely go to graduate school. You'd be an amazing literature professor. Seriously, added Connor Bradford, the pre-law student who usually dominated discussions. That analysis was better than some of the critical essays we've been reading. You have a real gift for this. Trevor Street. James nodded emphatically. I was completely lost until you explained it that way. You made it make sense. I watched Malik's face light up with genuine appreciation for his classmates' recognition. But more than that, I saw him relax in a way I had never noticed before. For perhaps the first time all semester, he wasn't carrying the invisible burden of proving he deserved to be in that room. He wasn't translating himself or moderating his intelligence to make others comfortable. He was just a brilliant student, sharing his insights with peers who valued his contributions. The change in the other students was equally remarkable. They began to seek out Malik's perspectives during discussions, to build upon his ideas rather than competing with them. Study groups formed naturally around his analytical abilities, and I often saw him in the library surrounded by classmates who wanted to understand how he approached literary analysis. After class that day, he lingered behind as other students filed out, their voices animated with discussion of the novel and the connections Malik had helped them understand. Thank you, he said simply, packing his books with the careful precision I had come to recognize as characteristic of everything he did. For what? I asked, though I thought I knew. For changing, for doing the work. It made a difference, not just for me, but for everyone in the class. When you stopped questioning my intelligence, it gave everyone else permission to recognize it too. I felt tears prick my eyes as I understood the full impact of what he was telling me. My unconscious bias hadn't just affected my relationship with him, it had influenced the entire classroom dynamic, creating an environment where his contributions were subtly devalued and his brilliance was systematically overlooked. Thank you for being patient with me while I figured it out, I said. And thank you for trusting me enough to help me become better. Professor Mitchell, he said with that warm smile I had come to treasure. That's what education is really about, isn't it? All of us learning from each other, all of us becoming better than we were before. As the semester progressed, our relationship evolved into something that resembled a true mentorship. Though I was no longer certain who was mentoring whom, Malik began stopping by my office hours regularly. Not because he needed help with assignments, his work remained exceptional, but because we had developed a genuine intellectual friendship built on mutual respect and shared love of literature. During these conversations, he shared more about his family's history and his own aspirations. He talked about wanting to pursue graduate studies in American literature, with a focus on how narratives shape social perception and challenge systemic inequalities. He dreamed of becoming a professor himself someday, of creating classroom environments where every student's intelligence could flourish regardless of their background. He also shared some of the challenges he continued to face, even as our classroom became more welcoming. He told me about encounters with campus security who questioned his presence in certain buildings, about social situations where he was assumed to be an athlete rather than a scholar, about the constant microaggressions that reminded him that his place in academic spaces was still seen as conditional by many people. These conversations were difficult for me to hear, but essential for my continued education. They helped me understand that changing my own behavior was just the beginning, that I had a responsibility to examine and challenge systemic biases throughout the institution, to advocate for policies and practices that supported all students, and to use my position of privilege to amplify voices that might otherwise be marginalized. Malik graduated magna cum laude 2 years later, delivering a senior thesis on the evolution of African American literary criticism that was so exceptional it was nominated for the university's top undergraduate research award. He was accepted to graduate programs at Princeton, Yale, Stanford, and Harvard, ultimately choosing Stanford, where he received a full fellowship to pursue his PhD in American literature with a focus on how narratives shape social perception and challenge systemic inequalities. We still exchange emails regularly, and he still challenges me to be better. He sends me articles about unconscious bias in academia, book recommendations that expand my understanding of literature and social justice, and updates about his research that continue to amaze me with their sophistication and insight. He has become not just a former student, but a colleague and friend whose wisdom continues to shape my teaching and my understanding of the world. But the most important thing I learned from Malik Washington extends far beyond the walls of my classroom and the boundaries of academic life. I learned that prejudice isn't always loud and obvious, manifesting in dramatic acts of discrimination or overt expressions of hatred. Sometimes it's quiet and insidious, living in the spaces between our conscious thoughts and our unconscious reactions, shaping our behavior in ways we don't even recognize until someone forces us to examine them. I learned that being educated doesn't make you immune to bias. In fact, education can sometimes give us more sophisticated ways to justify our prejudices or to convince ourselves that we're more enlightened than we actually are. Having a PhD and teaching literature about social justice doesn't automatically make you a just person. It just gives you more complex vocabulary to rationalize your unconscious biases. Most importantly, I learned that real change requires more than just recognizing our biases. It requires the humility to be corrected by those we have wronged, the courage to sit with discomfort and uncertainty, and the commitment to do better even when no one is watching. It requires accepting that the work of becoming less prejudiced is never finished, that we must constantly examine our assumptions and challenge our comfortable ways of thinking. That young man taught me that when we judge someone by their name, their appearance, or our assumptions about their background, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to learn from their brilliance. We diminish not only them, but ourselves, cutting ourselves off from perspectives and insights that could enrich our understanding of the world. Malik's backpack was never filled with anything surprising or dramatic, despite the title of this story. It was filled with books, ideas, dreams, and the accumulated wisdom of a family that had refused to let prejudice define their possibilities. The real revelation wasn't what was inside his backpack. It was what was inside my own heart. The unconscious biases I had been carrying without even realizing their weight and their impact on the students I claimed to serve. I still teach advanced American literature, but I teach it differently now. I start each semester by telling my students about the assumptions we all carry, the importance of questioning our first impressions, and the responsibility we have to see each other's full humanity. I tell them about a student named Malik Washington, who taught his professor that education is a two-way street, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from having the courage to admit when we're wrong. I've restructured my classroom to be more inclusive, incorporating authors and perspectives that reflect the diversity of human experience rather than defaulting to the traditional canon. I've examined my grading practices to ensure that I'm not unconsciously favoring certain types of writing or analytical approaches over others. I've learned to listen more carefully to what students say and how they say it, rather than filtering their contributions through my own preconceptions. Most importantly, I've learned to use my position of privilege and authority to amplify student voices that might otherwise be marginalized. When Malik made brilliant contributions to class discussions, I began to explicitly acknowledge their value and build upon them, showing other students that his insights were worth serious consideration. I started recommending students like him for academic opportunities and honors that they might not have been considered for otherwise. The impact of these changes has extended far beyond my own classroom. Other faculty members have noticed the shift in my teaching and have asked about my methods. I've shared Malik's story, with his permission, at faculty development workshops, helping other professors recognize their own unconscious biases and develop strategies for more inclusive teaching. The conversations have been difficult but necessary, challenging colleagues to examine their own assumptions and practices. I've also become more involved in university-wide efforts to create more equitable and inclusive academic environments. I serve on committees that review admissions practices, faculty hiring, and student support services, always asking questions about how our policies and procedures might inadvertently disadvantage certain groups of students. It's slow work, often frustrating, but it feels like the least I can do to honor what Malik taught me. The students in my classes now come from much more diverse backgrounds, not because the university's demographics have changed dramatically, but because I've learned to create an environment where different perspectives are genuinely welcomed and valued. Students who might have remained silent in my previous classes now participate actively, knowing that their contributions will be taken seriously regardless of their background or identity. They judged him by his name, expecting limitation where they found excellence, assuming disadvantage where they discovered privilege, looking for evidence of inadequacy where they should have celebrated brilliance. He showed them the power of refusing to be diminished by others' limitations, the strength that comes from carrying yourself with dignity in the face of prejudice, and the grace to forgive and educate even those who have wronged you. And in doing so, he freed us all to be better than our prejudices, more thoughtful than our assumptions, and more committed to creating the kind of world where everyone's brilliance has the space to shine without having to constantly prove its worthiness. The most beautiful part of this story isn't that Malik succeeded in spite of the obstacles he faced, though he did, magnificently. It's not even that he maintained his dignity and grace while dealing with ignorance and bias, though that took remarkable strength. The most beautiful part is that he chose to see potential for growth in someone who had wronged him, and he invested his time and energy in helping that person become worthy of the trust he placed in them. That's the lesson I carry with me every day now. We all have the power to choose how we respond to others' prejudices, but we also have the responsibility to examine our own. Real education isn't just about learning facts or mastering skills. It's about learning to see each other clearly, without the distorting lens of our assumptions and prejudices. In the end, Malik Washington didn't just earn his degree from our university. He earned something much more valuable: the knowledge that he had changed minds, opened hearts, and made the world a little more just, simply by refusing to be anything less than his authentic, brilliant self. And he gave me the greatest gift a student can give a teacher: the chance to learn something that made me better at my job and better as a human being. Every semester, when I look at my new roster and see names I don't recognize, names that might trigger unconscious assumptions, I think of Malik. I remember the weight of prejudice, the cost of assumptions, and the beauty of being wrong about someone in the best possible way. I remember that every name on that list represents a complete human being with their own story, their own struggles, their own brilliance waiting to be recognized and nurtured. That's the real lesson here. Our assumptions about others say far more about us than they do about them. And when we have the courage to question those assumptions, to sit with our discomfort, and to let ourselves be changed by what we learn, we don't just become better teachers or better colleagues. We become better human beings, more capable of seeing and celebrating the full humanity in everyone we encounter. The backpack was never the point. The point was learning to see beyond our prejudices to the person carrying it, and discovering that when we do, we find not just their humanity, but our own.